We are glad you're here today, and on behalf of the Friends of the Harlan-Lincoln Executive Committee, I'm Elizabeth Garles, and I welcome you again today to the series. Now, I also have purple on today because this is Go Tigers Day. We have two basketball teams playing in regional tournaments, and I have an update. Halftime for the men is 33-28 in our favor. Yay! Go Tigers! So we'll all be thinking purple today. Sorry. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to introduce the director of the Harlan-Lincoln House. In case you have not met, Spencer Barton. Here he is. We're very pleased that he has joined to tell the legacy story of the Harlan-Lincoln family, and you too will have an opportunity to hear from him in this series in 2 weeks. Next Tuesday, I'm going to tell you this twice. Next Tuesday, there is a change in location. If you have read the flyer, you will think we are elsewhere, and I won't even tell you where elsewhere is because I don't want anyone to get confused. Because we will be back in this location next Tuesday. We will have the presentation by Dr. Ron Rietveld that is listed on the flyer. We look forward to that, but remember, location next week is the same place as today. Keep that in mind. Of course, the usual drills asks you to turn off your phones. Thank you. And I am very pleased to introduce today a gentleman who absolutely needs no introduction, certainly a strong, long-time servant of the Friends of the Harlan-Lincoln House. Paul Juhl from Iowa City has been our presenter many times, and we are always eager to hear the new topic that he will share with us in this series. Now, Paul has been writing about Iowa history for, past 20 or 25 years. He's originally from Webster City. He holds degrees from the University of Iowa in history and the University of Northern Iowa in college student personnel services. He is retired. Paul served several Iowa high schools and also at a school in Switzerland as a counselor and as a teacher. His reading audience has always been Iowans. Paul likes to connect the aspects of natural and state history with his home state. He's an expert in photography in the late 19th century and often includes many images from all time periods in his books. The topics for his spiral-bound books are diverse, but you will be most familiar perhaps with his Grant Wood and Vinnie Ream, the country schools. He has talked about McKinley Cantor and Sarah Bernhardt, and of course, from our perspective, we're delighted that there is a book on Abraham Lincoln's grandchildren, and you too can see a copy of that on the display table as well as purchase for yourself, because we are very pleased with his Mount Pleasant Memories, the James Harlan and Robert Todd Lincoln families. So today we are eager to hear his story about Herbert Hoover coming home to Iowa. Paul, we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Liz. I have been looking forward to the presentation today, too, because I always enjoy being part of the Brown Bag series here at Iowa Wesleyan. So I'm happy to be with you today, and I'd like to share with you some photographs today from a very special time in the lives of the Herbert Hoover family. I think you will enjoy the talk. Most of these images came from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, and also a few of them came from the State Historical Society of Iowa. I've put them together as kind of a picture album, and I think it would be an album that if the Hoovers had put it together, they might have included these same slides. Well, let's go back to the summer of 1928, and this was just after the Republican convention that selected Mr. Hoover as a candidate in the fall election for President of the United States. The lives of Mr. Hoover, his wife Lou, and their two sons would soon change drastically, but it was decided that before the election they would take a homecoming trip to Iowa, the state where both Lou Henry Hoover was born in Waterloo and where Herbert Hoover was born in West Branch. They would start this Iowa Odyssey in West Branch, where Mr. Hoover was born, but they'd also visit the cities of Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, and Waterloo in just a short 3-day trip. This was a chance for them not only to see old friends and relatives, but also a chance to introduce their two sons to the people of Iowa. And of course, it was a political trip, so they wanted to meet with various farm groups, for instance. Now, just a little background to begin. As I said, Mr. Hoover was born in Cedar County in 1874, but when he was not yet a teenager, he and his two siblings were orphaned, and Mr. Hoover moved to Oregon with relatives. Lou Hoover, Mrs. Hoover, was born in Waterloo, but she left that city when she was about 11 years old. And it was then that her family, the Henry family, moved to California in hopes of greater opportunities. Well, the young couple, Herbert and Lou, met at Stanford University, and they were married in 1899. And adventure was certainly part of the early years of that marriage when they moved to China and the Far East. Later, Mr. Hoover assumed governmental positions during World War I, has become known as a great humanitarian because of that. And at the time of this visit to West Branch and after the nomination for president, he was actually serving as Secretary of Commerce under the administration of President Calvin Coolidge. Well, for the Hoover's two sons, and you'll see them pictured here, this visit was a chance after the really exciting Kansas City Republican Convention to see the people and places that their parents had spoke of so often. Herbert Jr. at that time was 25 years old, and his brother, younger brother Alan, was 21. And they were both at the beginnings of their career. Herbert Jr. had a degree from Stanford in engineering in 1925 and was married at that time. And Alan was a college student. And the sons were really looking forward to seeing our Iowa sites. So let's get started, and through the photographs, we'll join the Hoovers in 1928. Well, in the evening hours before August 21st, the date of the Hoovers' arrival, volunteers hosted large banners that appeared on several of the major streets of West Branch. This one was placed on North Downey Street, just north of Main. A second banner, as you can see in this photograph, taken perhaps on the morning of their arrival, was located at the intersection of Downey and Main Streets. The intent was most certainly to let everyone know that Mr. Hoover had been born here in West Branch, Iowa. Now, just before, the night before, they'd had a terrible rainstorm in West Branch, and many of the banners that they had placed had fallen down. Also, Lou Henry had gotten news on July 18th that her father had passed away, so they had some extra elements to contend with. The Hoovers came by train, and here is a large crowd milling around the train as it pulled into the West Branch station. The West Branch citizens, of course, were really excited to see them, and a band had begun to play, and the crowd was standing near this Rock Island train depot and the train that had brought the Hoover family to West Branch. For many, it was they had to rise early to get there in order to get a good spot in the audience to see Mr. and Mrs. Hoover and the two boys. The word had circulated through the crowd that they would depart from the caboose of the train, the rear end of the train. Here too you can see the depot building off in the background, and that had been planned then that open cars, convertible cars, would take them through the main business area of the town. Here Mr. Hoover is pausing briefly before he descends the stairs of the Golden State caboose just after its arrival at the station. You can maybe see the emblem of the Golden State because it contains oranges in it. I don't know how well you can see that. It's quite appropriate for the Hoovers, who now called California their home. The remainder of the Hoover family, Lou, the boys, would follow Mr. Hoover in leaving the train. By the way, Mr. Hoover was not without his hat that entire day, although Alan, the younger of the two brothers, was the person that carried it for him. Well, after departing the train, Mr. Hoover is looked upon with admiration. You can really see that in the looks of the gentleman there by several of the West Branch townsmen. As in the case in 1928, not only did they have hats, most of them, but the men dressed in really their Sunday, what we call their Sunday best, in the suits and neckties. They wanted to look their best, even though this, you remember, is August in Iowa, and the sun was certainly shining down on them. And among these admirers, one of them is, with that biggest smile there, is Henry Spangler. Ben Rowland is the next, and on the other side of Mr. Hoover is a man named Newt Butler. Now, Newt Butler, he was running the village of West Branch's soda water place and pool hall, as it was called. You remember that Prohibition had brought changes to this place of business. And the sign above his business on the north side of the main street read, Newt's Place, lunch, soft drinks, cigars, cigarettes. Although Newt was quick to tell anyone who would listen to him that he once, and occasionally he said twice or thrice, he would tell people that he licked Herbie Hoover in a fight. But at this time he certainly seemed to respect him. Later Newt, who would be among the West Branch group that traveled to Washington, D.C. for Mr. Hoover's inauguration. In West Branch, however, Newt liked to call himself the town's only Democrat. And some said he actually wrote a little song called Goodbye Cal, Hello Al, meaning, of course, the Democratic candidate who was running against Mr. Hoover, Al Smith. The West Branch teacher of both Newt Butler and Herbert Hoover, her name was Molly Brown when she was their teacher, later Molly Brown Karen. She did have a few things to say about Newt. She once said that even talking about Butler just makes her mad and tired. And another time when asked of the fight between Butler and Hoover, she said, Herbie never looked for trouble, but he could and would fight if he was picked on. She said, if Newt Butler really fought Herbie, as he says he did, I'm not so sure Newt won. Well, here the family is getting loaded into the 6-passenger vehicle that would take them through the town. The Rock Island Depot is on the left of this photograph. Several cars would make up the caravan that would go down the main street of the town. The open-air touring car with the Hoovers in the rear seat is snaking its way through the streets of West Branch here, heading for the birthplace home of Mr. Hoover. And all along the way, old friends would lean forward with a greeting to the couple. the teacher I just talked about, Mrs. Karen, she's sitting in the front seat there in appropriate teacher garb for the time, a black outfit there. And the family had been invited by a woman named Mrs. Skellers to have breakfast in the area of her home where Mr. Hoover had been born. And Mrs. Karen had also been invited. Now this is the way Mrs. Karen Molly Brown looked when she was a teacher. Most of the views we have of her are older views, but this was one that would have been taken back when she taught Herbert. She was known, they said, for both her discipline and her compassion. And Mr. Hoover considered her to be one of the reasons he had succeeded in life. She even offered to take Mr. Hoover in when he was orphaned, so their relationship was really a close one. Well, this was where they were headed. This is the way the house looked in 1928, and I know many of you have been to West Branch, but it's just that back portion, the one-story portion, was the cottage in which Mr. Hoover was born. Later on, they moved in a two-story addition there, and so they had enlarged the home some years before. And Mrs. Jenny Skellers wanted to entertain the family in that back portion, that one-story portion, for breakfast on this very memorable day. Actually, I even saw her menu, and her menu was quite Iowan, I thought. She was going to have sliced peaches and cream, powdered biscuits with honey, strawberry jam, ham and eggs, and fried potatoes. And most of that had come right out of the garden behind her house. This original home, by the way, that you can still go into today if you go to West Branch, was 14 by 20 feet. So pretty small area. She even had Mrs. Skellers even had a gift for the Hoovers. It was a cane that had been carved as a corn stalk from one piece of wood. And that piece of wood was taken from the original cottage when they did some of the remodeling. Mrs. Skellers died in 1934 at the age of 70. And she welcomed visitors into the home over the years before her death. One year she had 35,000 visitors. And she sold postcards, and many people considered her to be the Hoover House hostess. And this is, of course, that back portion of the house that remains today. It's been turned around, but looks, I'm sure, much like it did when the Hoovers lived there. This is a great photo showing Mr. Hoover, Mrs. Hoover, and their two sons. Now, Herbert Jr. is the one to the left, and Alan is the one to the right, and they're standing in front of the building where life had begun for Mr. Hoover. As I said, it was altered and added to over the years, but that two-room cottage was still present, and that's where they ate breakfast. Mrs. Skeller had also presented Mrs. Hoover with a bouquet of fresh flowers that she had cut from the garden behind her home. It would be a couple of really busy days ahead for the family, but as you can see, they stood ready to see all that they could. After breakfast, the Hoover family first wanted to visit the cemetery where Mr. Hoover's parents were buried. And there they found these two modest stones at the burial sites of both Jesse and Huldah Hoover. There was a wreath there that day from the WCTU because Huldah had been very opposed to alcohol. Well, the crowd stayed back to give the Hoovers some privacy as they stood quietly for a short time. The inscription there on Jesse Hoover's stone read, "Come unto me, ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give thee rest." An interesting story about Jesse Stone was that when it was originally put in this Quaker area of the cemetery, the Quaker fathers decided it was too high, and it shouldn't be that high. In death, as in life, we should be modest. So they had to dig down and place it a little lower in the ground. Several times during the day, especially here, tears came to Mr. Hoover's eyes when he would remember the pain of the loss of his parents and the feelings of being an orphan during those final years in West Branch. Well, next up was an attempt to find the old swimming hole, along which was now referred to as Hoover Creek. Well, that small stream, of course, had meandered over the 40 years or so, and none of the men that had swum there knew exactly where it was, so they had a hard time looking for it. Everyone in this large group of men seemed to have a different idea, but most was certain of two things. It was by the railroad tracks, and there was a bunch of willows around it. Mr. Hoover remembered it as being quite muddy, and when the boys got home from swimming, they had to wash themselves thoroughly after a swim in the creek. And although it took a lot of searching, Mr. Hoover here is shown standing near the location of what he felt might be the old swimming hole. One can only imagine what he was thinking as he stood here alone, remembering happy times of messing in the mud and swimming of long ago. Next up, the local schoolhouse there in West Branch served as kind of the center of the activities during the day. And here they're leaving, Lou and Mr. Hoover are leaving with smiles and quickness of step, leaving the school. The school, as I said, had been a central spot for all kinds of activities, especially the radio broadcasting of Mr. Hoover's speech was going to be broadcast out on radios across America, and was adjacent to the two large tents where Mr. Hoover would be speaking that evening. Now, as you can see, some of the students in the school were forming a pathway with stalks of corn and were also wearing what they called their Hoover dresses. Now, many of the young people in West Branch, of course, would long remember that day. With excitement, I think, that only youth can bring, there were numerous shouts of joy from these young people. It's a little difficult to see these Hoover dresses or the corn stalks or banners, but many were shouting Hoover for president, and they all hoped to be photographed with Mr. and Mrs. Hoover. The two Hoover sons followed their parents out of the building, actually quite amazed at the outpouring of affection from the young people of West Branch. And of course, they needed to get together with their old classmates. And on either side of Mr. Hoover there seated were two of the teachers, but all of the others were members of Mr. Hoover's class. The classmates had certainly had stories to tell of Mr. Hoover, and how they had known him as a young boy. And Mr. Hoover himself also liked to tell stories about himself during the early years. A few of the classmates still lived in West Branch, but others had traveled many miles for this reunion. With the exception of the teachers, most of those assembled now were around 54 years of age when this photograph was taken. And of course, it was great to be able to reveal yourself as a relative on that August day. Many people were even calling it Hoover Day. And here are assembled a few members of the extended family, with most bearing the name Hoover or Pembleton. Written on the reverse of this photo given to Mr. Hoover were the words, "I thought you might like this photo of your aunts and uncles. The occasion was probably the picnic dinner that was reserved for mainly family members just before the major speech by Mr. Hoover that evening. And of course, these relatives were also very proud of Mr. and Mrs. Hoover's accomplishments. Well, as the day went on, the trains brought more and more people to West Branch. They were interested in hearing Mr. Hoover's speech that evening. There were concession stands all around every corner, and on this hot August day, especially popular were cold drinks from big tubs of ice. The evening meal they had with the relatives, again a typical Iowa meal, it was a picnic with fried chicken and lemonade. Well, with the two school buildings on the hill behind, they had erected these massive tents. That, if you know West Branch, they were erected on what is now what the West Branch people call their Rose Bowl, which is their football field that is right in kind of in the center of town. Some said the large tents had come from a circus in the area. Others maintained they had been borrowed from a Chautauqua that was passing by. At any rate, they were large enough for the thousands of people who had come to West Branch to hear Mr. Hoover speak. The tents were off the ground, which allowed for ventilation and also made it easier for those assembled on the grass surrounding the tents to hear what was being said inside. The area, as I said, is now where the local West Branch Bears team plays. This rare photograph shows the interior of one of the big tents just before any of the people were seated. As you can see, boards were placed on hollow cement bricks, and it provided some comfort, although it doesn't look very comfortable to me, for the estimated 15,000 people who would attend. Large supporting poles are also seen that kept the structure in place. People entering had to descend into the tent structure as the floor was lower than the adjoining land, but all positioned to get themselves to get the best view of the nominee, Mr. Hoover, and his family members. And of course, not everyone was able to find a seat under the tents, but late arrivals found plenty of room for blankets on the grassy banks nearby. The hot August day had begun to cool down a bit when Mr. Hoover began to speak. Many were very interested in what the politicians that preceded Mr. Hoover's speech had to say, and there was some musical entertainment for all to enjoy. Preparations made by the various committees in West Branch had made the entire experience enjoyable to all. Just prior to him walking out, a young woman named Ilsa Niemak played the Iowa corn song, and they all stood up, and you know the song, "We're from Iowa, Iowa." That's where the tall corn grows. Well, this large assembly seemed to erupt when the Hoover family entered, and Mr. Hoover delivered his speech in those early evening hours and spent some time in the speech just reminiscing. A wooden platform had been created for him and his family and the other honored guests, and in front of the lectern was the equipment needed to broadcast his speech to millions over the radio. Many of the honored guests, especially politicians, had also given short speeches during the afternoon, and most of the issues concerned farming and farm policies. They would later meet with Mr. Hoover in Cedar Rapids on the following day to discuss the ideas and concerns. The evening ended with everyone singing Auld Lang Syne and also the Star-Spangled Banner, which later became our national anthem but was not at that time. There was ovation after ovation, and the Hoover family did what many people did back in the 1920s. They stayed with relatives that night because there were no hotels or motels available in West Branch. Now, to put a football player in the middle of all of this, that's kind of amazing, isn't it? But there's an interesting side story that Fred Duke Slater, he had a concession stand near the tents and was selling chicken sandwiches. Now, Slater at that time was finishing up his law degree at the University of Iowa. He achieved that in 1928. He played professional football and was later a judge in Chicago for over 20 years. He had been an athlete at Clinton High School in Clinton, Iowa, and was on the 1918 to 1921 Iowa Hawkeye team. One would doubt if the Hoover family met Slater during the time in West Branch, but one could be assured that Mr. Hoover would feel strongly about a young man working hard to pay his tuition at the university. A dormitory and the football field at the University of Iowa are now named in the honor of Duke Slater. Well, after spending the night at the home of relatives in West Branch, the Hoovers left the next morning in a motorcade for Iowa City, the home of the University of Iowa and the former state capital of Iowa. It was just a short drive of 10 or 12 miles, but just outside the city limits, they noticed a boy named Bobby Farr. He was waving a banner, and Mr. Hoover asked if they could stop and he could meet the boy. Bobby was so honored and told the newspaper that if I were old enough, I'd be voting for Mr. Hoover. The Farr family went on to Cedar Rapids and waited on a bridge that they would be going under for a second look at the Hoover family. Mr. Hoover spotted him and waved. A couple of months later, Bobby sent a letter to Mr. Hoover, along with a newspaper photo of the two of them meeting along the road. He said he liked listening to the speeches Mr. Hoover made and was able to do so by hooking up to a neighbor's radio. He also told of being sick in bed for a time, and as you can see, he has a handicap. A short time later, Mr. Hoover wrote back to Bobby and wished him a speedy recovery, and he told him something was coming in the mail. Well, a few days later, Bobby got a big box in the mail, and it was a radio set, and the family said they would never forget Mr. Hoover's kindness. Well, the caravan went through large crowds along their official visit to Iowa City. This open-air car pictured had just turned the corner from Washington onto Clinton Street. And for those of you that know Iowa City, this corner at that time was known as the Whetstone Corner. I need to get a little water here. Because of a popular drugstore on the northeast part of the intersection. In just a minute or two after this photo were taken, the Hoover's party disembarked and walked to the east entrance of the old stone capitol. Mr. Hoover is shown here, and next to him is a man named George Baker, who was president of the Iowa Board of Education at that time. And any of you that have links to UNI, you'll know that one of the dormitories there, Baker Hall, was named in his honor. Also, the next one over, next to Lou Henry Hoover, is the president of the university, Walter Jessup. Mr. Hoover was really eager to see the old building since its renovation had been done just a few years before in 1922. They also went out the west entrance after the tour and looked out at what would one day be the large west campus for the school with the sports and medical facilities. The one thing that Lou Hoover remembered about the building was the unusual staircase. It was spiral and beautiful. And this building, you know, was built in the 1840s. Actually, when the renovation was done, a riser had to be added to the settling of the old building. Well, their time in Iowa City was brief, and the family went on to Cedar Rapids, about 20 miles to the north. Cedar Rapids citizens were also eager for a look at the Republican candidate for president. All along the route within the city, the lampposts were decorated with this ear of corn poster and a likeness of Mr. Hoover on the top. This young man's name was Robert Morton, and he's shown adjusting one of the colorful displays. The corn symbol was really a source of pride for Iowans, and thus they now connected with the pride of their native son, Mr. Hoover. The Hoovers were on their way to Brucemore at 2160 Linden Drive. There were crowds all along the route. This is in front of a large store called Newman's. It was a relatively new department store in Cedar Rapids. Their slogan was "One of Iowa's great stores." What is interesting about this particular photo is the fact on the back was written, "Taken by Mrs. C.P. Juhl, J-U-H-L." Well, that's my name is, my initials are P.C., so they were just turned around with my last name. Whether or not we're relatives, I have no idea. The air was full of excitement. There were deafening sound of whistles, hand clapping, and full-throated yelling. If you look closely, you might be able to see Mr. Hoover's profile. And this, of course, is Brucemore. And that would be where they would spend their night. It was owned by the Douglas family, but the Douglases had a summer house in Charlevoix, Michigan. So they weren't present at the time, but they were greeted by Mrs. Howard Hall. I'm losing my voice here a little bit, sorry. I think it's some of the allergies that are out there. They were first treated to a parade of flags by over 3,500 children. And especially the Girl Scouts were present because Mrs. Hoover really enjoyed the Girl Scouts. And at one point she sat on the lawn and sang songs that were familiar to the Girl Scout troops. And here is a photo of some of those kids. They were led by the co-band and made up of Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, also Campfire Girls, Pioneers, YMCA, Sunday School, etc. Well, that same afternoon then, the Hoover family broke up with Mr. Hoover attending meetings in Cedar Rapids, and Lou Hoover and her two sons traveling by car to Waterloo, which of course was her birth and hometown. Mrs. Hoover was pleased to be driven through the streets that she knew as a girl in Waterloo. It was also pleasing to be able to show her two sons some of the places that she had talked about. And one of the first stops was the house where she had been born. The site, actually, the house had been torn down a couple of years before. You can see it had been a business for a period of time. Actually, on that site now are two bronze statues that commemorate the site. One statue is by Chris Bennett, an Iowan from Bentonsport, and the other one is by John Jago. And here you see a large group of mainly women surrounding the Snowden house, And that's where the women's club was located. And here you see Lou speaking to the crowd. And the photographer here asked Mrs. Hoover to take a place among the women of the Women's Club. And she can be seen in the back row, 8th from the left, with a large hat. But I thank you for coming in today, and I hope you enjoyed this talk about personality.